I shall start my talk. I've been working on late Heidegger's posthumous manuscripts, so-called black notebooks, and my main focus is on how late Heidegger thought on time. So some thinks that there's no time theory in late Heidegger, but I'm opposed to that, and based on interpretations of posthumous manuscripts, I think I can clarify that there is actually time theory in his late thought, and in this, and I've been writing papers on several papers on that topic. And today I want to compare that late Heidegger's thought on time with Dogen's thought on time. And it's controversial, or if a late Heidegger is close to Dogen or not. So I try to contribute to that problem with this presentation. Okay. I'll start reading from introduction. This study undertakes a comparative analysis of Heidegger's and Dogen's respective conceptions of time. Both Heidegger's seminal work, Being and Time, and Dogen's Uji in his magnum opus Shobogenzo, feature the notions of being and time in the titles. And scholars have frequently noted the conceptual affinities between their perspectives. However, existing research has primarily focused on early Heidegger, particularly Being and Time, in comparison with Dogen, while examinations of late Heidegger, especially his notions of the fourfold, in relation to Dogen, remain limited. One possible reason for this scholarly gap is the relative scarcity and complexity of Heidegger's later discussions on time. For instance, his lecture, Time and Being, appears somewhat abruptly. Furthermore, even within Heidegger's scholarship, no definitive consensus has been reached regarding the interpretation of his late thought on time. Nevertheless, with the recent publication of the so-called black notebooks and other posthumous manuscripts, Heidegger's late reflections on time are becoming increasingly acceptable to analysis. This paper will first examine the relationship between Heidegger and Dogen in general in light of previous scholarship. It will then extend the comparative inquiry into to late Heidegger's conception of time in relation to Dogen's thought. This paper argues that in certain aspects, Heidegger's late philosophy exhibits great affinity with Dogen's temporal concept than his earlier work. 2. Commonalities between Heidegger's and Dogen's backgrounds against scholastic understandings. As Heine points out, Heidegger and Dogen both attempt to overcome their respective philosophical traditions because they both feel that those traditions express unacknowledged and deficient presuppositions concerning time. Dogen and Heidegger both maintain that the problematics of existence and the limitations of metaphysics are fundamentally and directly related to basic misconceptions concerning time. Heine and Stamble emphasize a fundamental philosophical parallel between Dogen and Nagarjuna. Both thinkers conceptualize liberation as intrinsic to samsara, other than a transcendent state beyond it. The Abhidharma school traditionally regarded liberation as an event occurring beyond time. In contrast, Nagarjuna posted that liberation can occur at all times. As Stamble notes, Dogen follows Nagarjuna in his rejection of nirvana or liberation as something beyond the cycles of birth and death. Like Nagarjuna, Dogen rejects the notion that anything can exist beyond time. Instead, he perceives time and the being of things as fundamentally interdependent and inseparable. And it is precisely within this inseparability that he locates liberation. However, while Nagarjuna articulates his philosophy through logical engagement, Dogen approaches the subject from experimental and phenomenological perspective. Through concrete examples such as pine trees, mountains, and human conditions, Dogen demonstrates that being cannot be conceived apart from time. In this way, he critiques what Stamble refers to as Buddhist scholasticism. Instead, Heidegger shares a fundamental philosophical affinity with Dogen. In his 1920-21 interpretation of the Pauline epistles in the New Testament, Heidegger critiques the conventional understanding of eschatological waiting, which frames the anticipation of God's return in a linear sequential manner. That is, he rejects the notion that one simply waits for God's second coming at a specific moment in time, after which God will arrive. Instead, Heidegger proposes that the very disposition of waiting for God's kingdom is itself already divine. Him, the divine is not situated beyond worldly time, as if it emerges only when temporal existence ceases. Rather, it coexists with time. This perspective closely parallels Dogen's conception of revelation as being possible within time rather than outside of it. Both Dogen and Heidegger challenge the scholastic interpretations of their respective traditions, advocating for an understanding of phenomena in accordance with phenomena themselves. In doing so, they seek to arrive at more authentic comprehension of tradition. Rather than perceiving events as merely occurring within a linear temporal flow, both thinkers structure past and future events within a non-linear temporality, relating all time to the self in a profound sense, expressed in Dogen's case as myself and in Heidegger's as Dasein. Furthermore, both critique the instrumentalization of the present as merely a means to the future. In other words, they reject the interpretation found in both Christianity and Buddhism that this life or the present exists primarily for the sake of the next life or the future. Instead, they emphasize the immediacy of the present, maintaining an awareness that truth can manifest itself at any moment. But Tsunoda observes, Dogen's esoteric philosophical thought on worldview, ontology, and temporality seem to lead to a simple conclusion. Life is really a series of living in the here and now, and we are reminded that we must strive to do so. For Dogen, enlightenment entails a capacity to perceive time from a broader, all-encompassing perspective, and this state of realization can occur at any moment. Similarly, for Heidegger, each present moment is of great importance, offering the existential choice between authentic existence or reversion to inauthentic existence. In Heidegger's view, to delay this choice by reasoning that death still remains distant or that second coming is yet to arrive constitutes an evasion of the possibility of authentic existence. Having outlined the general similarities between Dogen and Heidegger by drawing upon previous scholarship, the following discussion will examine these commonalities in more depth, specifically through the lens of the relationship between figure and ground in their respective conceptions of time. 3. Commonalities between Heidegger's and Dogen's thought on time, the condition that makes the meaning of the present possible. One of the most striking similarities between Dogen's and Heidegger's conception of time is the rejection of the idea that the present moment arises independently. Instead, they emphasize that time as a whole, as present and future, operates as the movement that renders the present possible. This totality of time will be referred to in this paper as time as ground or context. Dogen designates this all-encompassing temporality as Nikon and equates it with Jinkai, meaning the entire world. Similarly, in Heidegger's Being and Time, this holistic conception of time is articulated through the notion of significance, which is also referred to as worldliness. In the discussion of time, in part 2 of Being and Time, Volume 1, Heidegger further elaborates on this as the time horizon, also known as temporality, and reinterprets this horizon as the world. To examine these ideas in more depth, we will first consider Dogen's perspective before turning to Heidegger's. Dogen's concept of the world, Jinkai. In Dogen's magnum opus, Shobogenzo, he frequently employs the phrase Jinji Pokai, kore ikka meiju, ikka myoju, which translates to the entire world is one brightly shining gem. For Dogen, this world, this luminous jewel, is also Ku, Ku signifies Mujisho, the idea that nothing possesses an independent, self-sustaining essence. Rather, all things exist not only through independent relationships. Dogen refers to the totality of this interdependence as the entire world, Kokai, or Jinji Kokai. Dogen's concept of time and being, Fuji. The concept of this world as Ku also appears in the Uji festival of Shobogenzo. In Uji, Dogen states, I arrange and place myself as the entire world. Each thing in this entire world should be thought of as each time. Because of this reason, that being, time, and self are one and same, we must learn that various things and events exist in the entire ground, and that each and everything exists against the background of this entire ground. The mouse is time, the tiger is time, living is time, and the Buddha is time. These passages suggest that the entire world is constituted by myself, Hare, that is positioned and arranged. At any given time, something, which is myself, exists. In the background of that time, there exists Jinkai, or in other words, the totality of time, which is a totality of myself that has existed until then and will exist in the future. Yorism illustrates this totality or Jinkai as follows. The figure and ground of time for Dogen. Iwata interprets Dogen's same passage. I arrange and place myself as the entire world. Each thing in this entire world should be thought as time. Through the framework of the relationship between the pattern, Gara, and the ground, the of time. The pattern or the figure of time refers to distinct temporal instances expressed as at a certain time and at a certain time, corresponding to the central mountaintop, a black point. In Yorism is illustration. The ground of time, by contrast, serves as the background that enables the pattern of time to appear as a discrete moment. This ground corresponds to the area surrounding the central mountaintop in Yorism's picture. In other states, if we interpret Uji as arutoki at a certain time, it is the same as in our everyday usage, which means that the figure of the time is the issue. However, if we read it as Uji being time, it is probably trying to show the form of the ground of time. At least we are looking at the figure from the ground of time, just as we were looking at the shape of the waves shimmering above our heads from underwater. Moreover, this ground functions at the site where multiple patterns of time coexist. Iwata further argues that there exists a kind of place where the time of 40 years ago and the time today intersect and coexist. This place constitutes the very core of one's being, and this totality of place is, in essence, the totality of time. This idea parallels the representation of time through the illustration of mountains by Yoizumi. In this ground of time, there is no passage of time in the usual sense of the word. The particular moments of the ground of time is called kyoryaku by Dogen. And Heidegger would call it happening, Kishin. In Uji, Dogen writes, kyoryaku is from today to tomorrow, from today to yesterday, from yesterday to today, from today to today, from tomorrow to tomorrow. What is there in the ground of time does not pass away, but continues to exist and continues to influence the present figure of time. Ku and the pattern and ground of time. The concept of Ku signifies that no being exists independently, but always arises in relation to other beings. In other words, the pattern of each moment is inseparable from the pattern of other moments. It's the other form the ground of time as its totality. He originally explains this interdependent nature of existence as follows. In everyday consciousness, oneself and the other objects are considered to exist as separate entities. But Dogen rejects this mental reductionist attitude and insists that being is only possible when it is signified by the self. For example, the existence of a flower is possible in the difference from a tree and a stone. A flower is not a flower by itself, but becomes a flower when oneself divides this world and arranges it into flowers, trees, stones. and the flower becomes a flower when it has differentiating relationship with a tree, a stone, and other beings. The functioning of time of this underlying structure is referred to in this paper as the contextuality of time. This term signifies that no moment exists in isolation. Rather, each moment is constituted through its relational positioning within the totality of time, present and future. Similarities between Heidegger's theory of time and NUKUI. Both Watsuji and Heidegger's being time share a fundamental concern with the contextuality of time. In being time, a hammer cannot exist on its own, but only within a web of interdependent relations within the temporal structure of being can hammer be defined as a hammer. Heidegger calls this structure significance. Todoroki observes that Heidegger consistently emphasizes the contextuality of time throughout his work, regardless of the period. When we see a flying bird, we perceive not only the bird is doing now, but also what it has already been, what it could be in the future, from where and to where of the bird. In other words, when we understand that a bird is flying, we understand not only the present, but also the past and the future. And based on this very understanding, we understand that birds flying as flying. Being has some kind of contextuality, and the meaning of being can be understood only by grasping this context. It is fair to say that Heidegger redefines this context as time. The inauthentic way of Dasein means an attitude that separates a being from its relationships with various other beings that are essential to its being and makes it alone present. The authentic way of being, on the contrary, is an attitude that sees a being in relation to the surrounding beings. Moreover, Todoroki notes a conceptual parallel between Buddhist notion of emptiness and Heidegger's temporal ontology, although he does not explicitly connect Heidegger's idea to doyens. Both the Buddhist idea of emptiness and Heidegger's theory of time point out that each being and each time has its own context, background context, as indispensable for its formation. And the understanding of this is referred to as enlightenment in Buddhism and authenticity for Heidegger. As previously discussed, Dogen's thought on time is rooted in emphasis of emptiness. According to Dogen's Shogun Genjo Koan, to practice and realize all things by carrying oneself is to be lost. To practice and realize oneself when all things come forward is enlightenment. Here, Bambo means all beings. Takashi interprets this as follows. Lostness is the act of establishing a self, which should not be able to be established, and working on all objects. Enlightenment is the illumination of the self by the side of all objects. In the experience of enlightenment, time is perceived from an expanded, all-encompassing perspective. What is ordinarily conceived as the non-self or the other is recognized as integral to self. Everything is understood as a time of the self. For commonalities between Heidegger's and Dogen's thought, the relaxation of excessive interest in the present, attachment. Beyond the interplay of the figure and ground of time, another significant commonality between Dogen and Heidegger is their shared emphasis on the liberation of the individual from attachment to the mundane. In Heidegger's being in time, this liberation involves breaking free from the inauthentic existence of the everyday self, while in Dogen's thought it corresponds to the realization of emptiness. Furthermore, this process is intimately linked to an expansion of temporal awareness, the ability to perceive time in its totality. This transformation is from an ordinary state in which one fixates solely on the immediate figure before them to an enlightened state in which one perceives time as the ground. Time structure of significance, Heidegger. In Heidegger's framework, the everyday structure of significance is constituted through the projection of a particular possibility of Dasein's being, which is situated before the possibility of one's death. For instance, when the possibility of protection against bad weather is projected, a given being X is interpreted as a hammer or as a tool, serving as a means to actualize this possibility. However, when the projected possibility shifts to defending oneself against an armed group, for an example, the same being X may instead be interpreted as a weapon functioning as an instrument for combat. Thus, the interpretation of any given being is contingent upon the specific projection at play. While being may be understood in multiple ways as a tool, a weapon, the interpretation that most effectively serves the realization of Daseins possibility tends to take precedence. Such is the everyday significance. But when the possibility of one's own death is understood as an imminent and ever-present possibility, these normal prioritizations cease to function. This is because when faced with the possibility of death, the ordinary in order to, the to linkage, which presupposes that one will not die for some time, ceases to function. No matter what we do or not, death, when it comes, will come. Since we can die without doing anything, without using any means, any interpretation of any being cannot function as a means in the face of death. They become, in a sense, equal value in the face of death. As a result, the state of insignificance, Unbedeutsamkeit, is realized. And even in the authentic existence of Dasein, its taking care, Bezogen becomes indifferent for itself. This indifferent perspective offers insight into an alternative experience of time, one that differs fundamentally from the ordinary linear understanding of temporality. In this experience, every moment of one's past, present, and future are valued as equivalent, without hierarchical distinctions, and are apprehended as integral to one's own being. Heidegger's conception of time in this regard may resonate with Bergson's philosophy. According to Bergson, when one's attention to life diminishes, time ceases to be structured in a manner conducive to the pragmatic demands of daily existence. As he observes in Spiritual Energy, now if your attention to life diminishes for moments, then the mind, whose gaze was possibly held forward, relaxes and thereby looks back, where the mind finds all its history. The panoramic vision of the past is therefore due to a sudden disinterest in life, born of the sudden conviction that one is going to die at any moment. For Bergson, this sudden disinterest in life allows the past, typically subordinated to the demands of the present, to resurface in its own right, liberated from its usual instrumentalization. A similar movement of time is evident in Heidegger's notion of time as something that stretches out. The possibility of recognizing wider temporalities, what Heidegger refers to as the extension of Dasein between birth and death, the Erstreckung des Daseins zwischen Geburt und Tod, ordinarily obscured by everyday absorption in the world, is reawakened as something that truly belongs to us. This recognition in turn enables the existential process of authentic projection and retrieval, through which time is reclaimed in its authentic dimension. So yeah, analogies to Heidegger's notion of the ever-present possibility of death and Bergson's idea of detachment from present-centered consciousness, William's philosophy is characterized by the recognition of coup, the impermanence and non-substantiality of all things. This entails an awareness that all phenomena lack fixed essence and cannot serve as ultimate objects of attachment. Through coup, one maintains a non-discriminatory apprehension of time, a perspective in which all temporal moments, whether joyous or sorrowful, sacred or mundane, are understood as constituting an undifferentiated array of the self. In this sense, all moments are of equal significance, equally proximate, and equally detached from hierarchical valuation. Inami articulates this idea as follows. The time consciousness that lies before our everyday time consciousness, the time consciousness that lies before the division of time into past, present, and future, if we dare to call the former time consciousness, original temporality, in the volume of Uji, such temporality is called Nikon. And the way of the movement of Nikon is Kyoryaku. What this means is that time that flows and passes cannot be realized unless the act or the memory of the act is arranged with a sense of purpose in mind. If a person who needs to hurry to his destination gets on a train, he will be conscious at every station that I'm here now, I will be there next, and I'm almost there. It is in this consciousness that the scenery seen from the window of the train flows and passes. But for those who are riding vaguely or wandering without any particular purpose, it doesn't matter at all when and where they arrive. And then the view from the window is merely changing within the window frame. Even when we recall the scenery later, there is no clear back and forth order in our memories. And we will only be able to talk about how we saw this and that. This is the time to look over 1,000 peaks, a situation that is said to not pass away by Dogen. When climbers stand at the top of the mountain and take a break to look around at the mountain peaks, they do not necessarily look at them in the order in which they climbed them. In essence, Heidegger, Bergson, and Dogen converge on the fundamental insight: detachment from one's immediate pragmatic concerns. Whether Heidegger's projected everyday possibility, Bergson's attention to life, or Dogen's for an ordinary man's teleological view of time, enables a broader panoramic comprehension of time. This expanded temporal awareness manifests itself as stretched time in Heidegger's thought, a panoramic view in Bergson's, and Nikon in Dogen's. In all three cases, time is experienced as an undivided whole, wherein past, present, and future are recognized as equally integral to one's being, equally proximate, and equally freed from instrumental valuation. For Heidegger's folding interpretation, a parallel structure can be observed in Heidegger's early theological reflections, appearing in his 2021 polling interpretation, which has the prototype discussion of waiting time. Interpreting 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 29 to 32, Heidegger articulates a stance toward the world that closely resembles his later notion of anticipation toward death. But I say, brethren, that time is short. It remains that both they that have lives be as though they had none, and they that weep as though they wept not, and they that rejoice as though they rejoiced not, and they that buy as though they possessed not, and they that use this world as not abusing. For the fashion of this world passes away. Heidegger emphasizes that Paul does not use negation, but post me as though not, signaling an attitude of detachment rather than outright denial. Heidegger argues that Christian existence is characterized by an acute awareness of the compressed temporality in which the believer must live constantly in the little left, thus no, without deferring action into an indefinite future. This urgency precludes procrastination and necessitates a mode of being in which one is simultaneously engaged with the world and yet not fully defined by it. This notion parallels Dogen's critique of conventional attachment, wherein an enlightened individual perceives only certain moments as integral to the self while excluding others. In contrast, the enlightened perspective regards all moments as equally constituted of one's being, without privileging one temporal moment over another. In this expanded view of time, Heidegger sees the possibility of reinterpreting one's past, future, and present in a manner fundamentally distinct from the conventional goal-oriented experience of time. Dogen likewise argues that Buddhist enlightenment is not a matter of attaining some future state beyond one's present condition, but rather a realization of time itself from a vantage point, unbounded by theological constraints. Ultimately, both thinkers locate the essence of their respective traditions, Christianity and Buddhism, not in doctrinal formations, but in this transformed understanding of time as totality. Differences between Heidegger and the early periods and Dogen: insufficiency of one and two in being time, this true world. In the preceding discussion, this paper has delineated the fundamental similarities between Dogen's and Heidegger's conception of temporality. For both thinkers, the ground of time is characterized by one, its role as the condition that renders the meaning of the present possible, horizontality, and two, a state of detachment from an excessive preoccupation with the present, allowing for a more comprehensive panoramic view of temporality. Abe Masao, however, contends that early Heidegger diverges fundamentally from Dogen, as Heidegger ultimately maintains an anthropocentric framework, while there exists significant thematic parallels between the two. Abe's claim holds merit. This divergence arises from the fact that for Heidegger, despite the emphasis on one, horizontality, and two, the detachment from immediate temporal concerns in time as ground, Heidegger's conception remains fundamentally humanistic and teleological. For the first point, in being and time, the boundaries of time as ground are limited to the individual's birth, debut, and death thought. For the second point, even when Heidegger describes the process by which extreme concern for the present is relinquished in anticipation to death, enabling the projection of authentic possibilities and the retrieval of forgotten past, time as ground remains structured teleologically by an authentically projected purpose. However, Heidegger's posthumously published manuscripts indicate that by the mid-1930s, he had grown self-critical of these aspects of being and time. He acknowledges that what he calls an error, Ilton, in his earlier work, particularly in defining Dasein as an entity that exists for the sake of itself, existierend und seiner. In 1936, he writes, the deepest error in being and time is first of all the determination of Dasein as existing for the sake of itself. Dasein is neither for the sake of itself nor at all for the sake of. For the sake of, und seiner arises from the existential approach here instead of hiding, destroying. Destroying. Connection of history and world, but existentially bent and narrowed to true world of Zeugwelt verengt. To restate this in relation to the core argument of this paper, time as ground in being time was conceived in an anthropocentric and teleological manner. This teleological structuring of the world concept in being time is precisely what Levinas critiques in his totality and infinity. According to Levinas, activity does not borrow its meaning and value from a single ultimate goal, as if the world formed a system of useful references, the end of which concerns our very existence. The two themselves, which are in order to become objects of pleasure. Yet, significantly, prior to the criticism by Levinas, Heidegger himself had already begun to critically reassess this teleological orientation of temporality in being and time by the mid-1930s and initiated the thought that led to the fourfold. His work in the mid-2030s, in the 1930s, introduced the concept of time-space as a non-objective, non-anthropocentric expression of time. Abe and Heine, however, argued that despite Heidegger's departure from his earlier anthropocentrism, the later conception of the fourfold also remains fundamentally anthropocentric and thus diverges from Dogen's perspective, which is inherently anthropocentric from the outset. Abe maintains that even in Heidegger's late thought, the priority of openness over presence, that is, the priority of time over being, shows a trace of anthropocentrism. However, this claim remains highly debatable. It is not evident that even in his later philosophy, Heidegger's conception of temporality retains a humanistically teleological orientation that takes precedence over being. According to Jung, Heidegger's later philosophical orientation would, however, make superfluous Abe's contention concerning Heidegger as contrasted with the Zen master Dogen. Similarly, Stambol and Jenkins contend that Heidegger's late philosophy, particularly his notion of the fourfold, shares deep affinities with Dogen's thought. By engaging with recently published posthumous manuscripts, this paper argues that Heidegger's late conception of the fourfold presents a resolution to the inadequacy of wide horizontality and the detachment in being time. This development signals Heidegger's decisive move away from anthropocentrism, thereby reinforcing the similarities between his late thought and Dogen's thought. 6. Narratives between late Heidegger and Dogen's thought on time, thoroughness of 1 and 2 in the fourfold. 1. For the first point, in Heidegger's late thought, the temporal horizon of future and past extends beyond the individual birth and death. Limitations characteristic of being time to encompass the entirety of the history of being, thereby integrating rather than outright rejecting the framework of being time. Heidegger himself acknowledges this shift already in the mid-2030s in his posthumous manuscript, where he critically reflects on the limitations of his earlier existential perspective. History and time-space, the mistake here is the limitation to the extension of the in-between existential. Birth and death only act as the end of this in-between, where they themselves belong to history. Heidegger critiques this existential limitation as the arrest, the haftung in temporality, care, and laments that the existential orientation is too narrow and too poor. By contrast, in Dogen's thought, the scope of time is not constrained by anthropocentric existential parameters, but is inherently vast from the beginning. In Uji, he states that even Jorok Hashaku, this symbolizes the Buddha, is time, as are the earth and the void. For the second point, a crucial shortcoming in being time is its inadequate detachment from the purposefulness. Even in the anticipation to death, anticipation of death affords a broader perspective on time as striking compared to the myopic engagement of das Man, the everyday absorption in the present. It ultimately remains bound to the projection of particular existential possibilities. Consequently, being in time does not fully overcome the instrumentalization of time, as it continues to be oriented toward an authentically projected future. Only being free for death makes Dasein its absolute goal and knocks existence into its finitude. In contrast, Heidegger's conception of the fourfold moves beyond this purposive framework. As already mentioned, Heidegger critiques the earlier objectivistic conception of the world, describing it as a true world that is bent and narrowed. In the late thought, the fourfold signifies a mode of being in which things are inseparably entwined with earth, sky, human beings, and divinities. The thing is surrounded by all of the four, reflecting all the four within the time of the fourfold. Heidegger calls the movement of time as ground involved in the fourfold, the fourth dimension, the fiat dimension of time in his posthumous manuscript. This can be described as the awareness that one is entered in the entire context of the future, the past, and the present. Although time and being ostensibly retains some terminological continuity with being and time, its fundamental distinction lies in the fact that time is no longer conceived in humanly teleological terms. The precise relationship between Heidegger's late temporal theories and the fourfold have traditionally remained ambiguous. However, an examination of recently published posthumous manuscripts clarifies that the fourth dimension of time is time that constitutes the fourfold. Heidegger states that the fourth dimension of time is the authentic and only dimension of the fourfold. Heidegger also writes, the fourfoldness of the dimension of time in the sense of the interdivisible time-space is based on the fourfold of interdivisible, but does not coincide with it. Rather, the whole essencing of time is in the foreign fourfold. Each of the elements that make up the fourfold, earth, sky, divines, and human beings, are considered to be matters that are possible in the fourth dimension of time. Dogen, by contrast, does not conceive of time in teleological terms from the outset. His assertion that pine trees and bamboos are also time reflects a fundamentally non-instrumentalized view of temporality. Pine trees and bamboos can be taken in multiple senses, like choosing Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Earth, or jugs in his thing, lecture. Thus, an examination of Heidegger's late work, particularly in light of his posthumous manuscripts, reveals that he ultimately moved beyond the anthropocentrism of his earlier theory of time, bringing his later thought into even closer alignment with Dawkins' deep anthropocentric temporality. 7. The uncontrollability of time as ground and the awe of it. As discussed in chapter 4 of this paper, Milan argues that once an objective is established, it becomes easier to structure and organize time as a means to achieve that goal. However, in the absence of defined purpose, the temporal sequence becomes ambiguous, analogous to the way one easily forgets the order of passing scenery observed from a train when defined destination is absent. In Dawkins' law, time as ground responds to this latter indeterminate form of temporality, in which sequential order remains unclear. Ordinarily, such ambiguous experiences of time are regarded as lapses in memory, errors, or distortions that should be rectified through accurate recollection documentation. For Dawkins, however, this seemingly chaotic temporality constitutes the fundamental reality of time itself, whereas an orderly conception of time is a secondary, artificial construction derived from this primordial ground of time. In Being and Time, Heidegger describes significance as a temporal mechanism that enables Delta to interpret a being, a hammer, as what it is. However, the anticipation to death, the familiar routinely ordered time is radically dismantled. Through this existential confrontation, an authentic possibility is projected, the past is retrieved as an authentic past, and the entire ordered time is reorganized. This implies that, as in Dawkins' view, a more fundamental form of time underlies a sequential teleological time, serving as the very condition for its emergence. During the period of being time, however, both everyday time and the authentic temporality were framed within a teleological structure. Heidegger's focus at this time was not on the dynamic process through which time undergoes a reconfiguration, what he later refers to as the unity of time, nor on the more fundamental pervasive temporality that underlies and enables these transformations. In a posthumous manuscript written in his later years, Heidegger self-critiques being in time as follows. First of all, in Being in Time, the question of the unity of the three ecstasies is not discussed anywhere because the unity, that first one, cannot be grasped from any of them. According to Heidegger, such unity is the fourth dimension of time. Time, it has not one and not three, but four dimensions. The fourth, however, is the first. The first here does not mean a series of ordinary numbers, but the essencing in the ends. This determines the essencing of the dimensional. The first is a lightning covering distant, eventful, introducing closeness, in which an own arrival and therefore initially the future and the known characters are emphasized. By the mid-1930s, the origin of the work of art reinterpreted the significance of being in time, reducing it to discourse primarily concerned with usefulness. Heidegger then introduced a deeper stratum, reliability, which underlies and makes possible the domain of usefulness. This shift is exemplified in his discussion of Van Gogh's famous painting of shoes, where the defective shoes is not merely understood in terms of their instrumental function to wear, but as something that belongs to a more profound reality of the earth and the world. Although the origin of the work of art does not explicitly address the temporality that underpins this dimension of reliability, it is this deeper aspect of time that Heidegger would later explore more fully in his Time and Being lectures and posthumous writings. In these later works, Heidegger turns to his attention to pervasive pre-objective temporality that underlies the teleological goal-oriented structure of time. He refers to this as the fourth dimension of time, a notion that is also central to his conception of the fourfold. These forms of temporality bear striking similarities to Dawkins' notion of everyday time. The pervasive aspect of time resists objectification and instrumental control. For both Heidegger and Dawkins, this fundamental nature of time is intimately tied to a certain religiosity. It entails an awareness of so-called forces beyond human control. Audience cool Heidegger's notion of being as something superior or holiness. This recognition fosters a sense of awe before what exceeds human grasp, along with an attitude of attentiveness and engagement with this religiosity to the extent possible. Crucially, neither Dogen nor Heidegger conceived of enlightenment or the divine as something absent in the present, but someday attainable in the future. Instead, they emphasize the necessity of recognizing what already surrounds and overwhelms us. Consequently, in Heidegger's late philosophy and in Dogen's thought, the expectation of acquiring something not yet present is negated. Heidegger's notion of waiting, das Warten, and Dogen's practice of just sitting, shikantaza, are not directed toward the fulfillment of some deferred objective. Rather, they cultivate an awareness of the overwhelming inherent in the immediate and all the existence. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, the paper was very long.
Okay, let's start with questions or comments. Maybe we have 10 minutes more or less. Okay, yes, thank you. And okay, Sova is, where is Sova?
Let's begin. Yeah, thank you. I think I really enjoyed how you were able to kind of bring the conversation about Heidegger and Dogen into kind of a really new and constructive light, I thought.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I think I have maybe two questions and they're interrelated. So the first question is, I couldn't help but in the footnotes, I keep seeing these suggestions of a connection to Freud and the unconscious. And so I was curious, maybe the first part of my question is, why are you in Freud's? What do you intend by how that could complement the discussion?
Okay, the footnote about Freud is footnote 24 and here, yeah, and 52, yeah. The similarities here between Dogen, Heidegger, and also Freud is that they see no passage of time in the deeper aspect of time. So for Dogen, it's Kyoyaku, and he says that tomorrow becomes the time flows from like tomorrow to today, or today to yesterday, and that's not an ordinary flow. And Heidegger, for example, Gewisenheit, having been, can be recorrected again, retrieved again, so it doesn't pass away. And Freud also says that in unconsciousness, time doesn't pass. So even if something happened 20 years ago, that event comes up to you as if it occurred yesterday or just now, like a trauma. It doesn't disappear unless some special like treatment is done. So for Freud, in the domain of unconsciousness, time has some different movement. It's not like, so it's 20 years ago, it's so far away, and what happened yesterday is so vivid, and it doesn't work that way for Freud, and there is similarity, I think. So in the illustrations of mountains, so it's not that mountains of 20 years ago is so far away, and mountains of yesterday is close. Maybe mountain of 20 years old, it is very close to you, while yesterday's mountain is very far away. So this, is where I see the similarities.
Oh, great. Okay, that's good. That kind of leads to the second question. And yeah, you mentioned there that for Freud, there's this possibility of cure or treatment. And I think that based on my rough understanding, he is kind of in this tradition of finding some kind of harmony in the soul. We go back to Plato, for example, this idea of eros, how to have a kind of unity of the soul. And when we talk about this kind of unity, it's not a forward projected means ends instrumental purposiveness, right? So for example, I don't do treatment, or I don't gain self-awareness in order to someday, have perfect unity of my soul. But it's kind of like health, like eating foods that are good for the body, and exercising is just being healthy. It's not so that one day later on I will become healthy in the future, right? And so it's a kind of purposiveness without this kind of instrumental future-oriented purposiveness. And I was wondering then, if we now look at Heidegger and Dogen, are they even trying to eliminate this kind of purposelessness as well?
I don't think. Oh yeah, I agree too. I mean, I don't think that they're trying to deny even that kind of purposefulness, because Dogen doesn't reject to sit down. So he says you should sit down. It's in a way it's purposeful, but Dogen says you should not sit for the sake of something. You should sit, but you shouldn't expect any other things.
Not a means-ends relationship.
And the reason why I think the reason why Dogen says in this manner is that if you have this for the sake of mind, you can't reach what Dogen is trying to reach. So so for Freud too. Consciousness can't be handled in a normal way,
Yes.
Like I will eat some pancake and then I make pancake. This is pretty normal and very causal, and you can expect something. But when you try to handle unconsciousness, you can't deal with it in this manner. So you have to change strategy. And so for Freud too, he uses this, I don't know if it's effective, but he uses dreams and he uses this associations. It's not the usual way. And for Dogen, it's sitting. So the commonalities is that they both don't use normal causal strategy, I think.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You have a question or something from Professor Ohashi?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Nuki-san.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah. Nukui-san. Nuki-san.
Nukui.
Nukui-san. For quite interesting and beautiful speech. I have one question. You quoted an example of a flying bird, and also quoted the interpretation of Todoroki. Now, I have exchanged I have discussed with him online over the meaning of the flying bird. And I'm not yet convinced by his explanation, but in order to, sometimes I will ask him again. But this time, I would like to hear your view, namely, and I have written to Todoroki that what is expressed through or by the flying bird is that in German to say giant height or sein or emptiness. And the question which is combined to this first question is, how would you I could ask this question also to Loft Sensei. How would you translate the German word giant height into English? And also giantess. That is a difficulty which I also have had. But at first, I have listened to Todoroki, what he says, what he thinks. is not being in the sense of Heidegger, but Seienheit. And in order to make clear the difference between Seienheit and Sein, that being and Seienheit and Sein. And we have not brought the discussion to the end. But at first, would you like to say that in and through and by a flying bird is Sein or Seinheit is expressed?
Yeah, I agree in this point to Professor Todoroki's interpretation. He is talking about birds here to show what Sein is. So the future of the birds and the past of that birds are, according to Todoroki, and I also think so, but it's the example behind. So, and this kind of design is not usually the object of one's thinking. So you won't think of, like, when you're looking at a bird and think, oh, this bird came from that mountain, and then this bird will fly to that tree again. You won't be conscious of these kind of things, but you just see a bird and just understands that this is bird. And the reason why this works, the reason why we just can understand what bird is and that bird is in front of you is because for Todoroki and I, and also I think for Heidegger, we already understand the future of the bird and the past of the bird. And I think for Todoroki, and I think Derrida thinks in the same way, but this whole so-called unconscious, if I can use the word of Freud, which I don't think Heidegger is very glad about. This unconscious understanding of time is one aspect of Sein, I think. And Seienheit, when Heidegger uses this term, I think Seienheit is Sein that has become object of one's thinking. So if I explain, I try to explain the structure of time, and then it became Seienheit because we just objectified the future and the past, but we don't usually do this. And when we usually do this, then Sein is there, I think. So to your second question, how I translate Seienheit in English will be beingness that has become the object of thinking. It may be too long for translation of one word, but I understand in that way. Maybe too weird for an understanding of Heidegger, but and I have no idea how I should translate Zionist, because I just thought, why not being? Being has so, but I thought maybe your point of question is Zionist has this this meaning of the movement, like Zion. So something that is being right now. be one translation. I don't know, but
To make my question to make my question a little exacter, I would add something. When we, Todoroki or you or I, try to compare Heidegger and Dogen, then at first it is somehow convincible what Todoroki-san or you say, namely that when a bird is flying, the past and future and present of the bird is expressed, okay. And how then that is also possible interpretation, I think, and I have no objection. The point in which I am not yet quite content is that Dogen says, tori tonde tori no gotoshi. As the bird is flying, expressing its future and present and past. Okay. And how do you then understand Dogen's expression? The bird is as if it is bird. You have mentioned a little in your paper to this word, but this as if or gotoshi, tori no gotoshi, or like, bird is like a bird. Bird is as if it is bird. This as if or I would like to know this the meaning of this word a little more exactly, because in Dogen, so far as I understand him, not being but emptiness is expressed. And in connection, in regard to this Dogen's thought of emptiness or Genjo Koan, I would like to know how you understand this as if or like. The one about it flying, expressing its future, present, and past. Okay. And this bird is like a bird. What is the sense of this word?
yes, it's not that I'm so convinced of what I will say from now, but my interpretation is that as if is not something that that people put on something. Like I is not I that think that bird is flying as if it's flying. I mean, the bird flies, bird comes into this condition of as if by itself. So to me, this tori tonde tori no gotoshi, this expression reminds me of Heidegger's worlds. One interpretation of Dogen, which I wrote on the last footnote, 55, there's this interpretation that to express Dogen's thought, these following expressions might be appropriate, which are 座禅が座禅する、座禅が座禅を座禅する、or 仏が仏を仏する。These are expressions that Tsunoda is introducing. And what you just asked me, tori tonde tori no gotoshi, reminds me of these expressions, that tori becomes as if by itself. So it's not I or someone who tries to make tori as if tori. So horseman in Heidegger's expression is not something that one deliberately tries to put on something.
And do you think that with this as if the wholeness of the being of the body is expressed, or the emptiness?
I think for Dogen, wholeness means at the same time emptiness. So I think my interpretation is that this passage is meaning both the wholeness and the emptiness.
And the giant height is the wholeness or not quite the same with wholeness.
To me, I have the impression that giant height is not this kind of wholeness or emptiness.
Mhm.
When Heidegger uses this word, giant height, this giant height means that it's being represented for Gestalt. It's the wholeness, but it's represented as something else. So it's not the wholeness itself. It's my interpretation for now, but I don't know if I'm saying something. I don't know what I'm
Do you, okay, the last question. Do you believe that Heidegger will agree with you when you say that the wholeness, the being in his sense can be replaced by the word wholeness? That's German idealism.
Heidegger uses the word das Sein im Ganzen, and in his 1930s.
Yeah.
And that, yeah,
That is the wholeness. Yeah.
yeah. So he uses the similar word, as das Sein im Ganzen, and this means, according to my interpretation, that when something is, then there is a wholeness
Mhm.
too. So das Seiende is im Ganzen. So das Ganze is also there.
So you mean that das Sein im Ganzen ist gleichbedeutend mit dem Sein?
Yes, in my interpretation, yes. In some period of time.
That is that nicht, it is nicht Seinsvergessenheit.
But,
Okay, we can continue our discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So thank you very much, Professor Nukui.
But there is
Another question. Okay. Yes.
すみません。今の鳥が鳥のごとく飛ぶみたいな、それは平安時代の文法だったんじゃないかなと。だから、英語だと、as we expect birds to fly。だから鳥はそのように飛んでいると、そのままに、その性質のままに飛んでいると、素直にそのまま飛んでいると、理解することができるんじゃないかと、それだけです。すみません。
道元は別です。この言葉を言ったのは、そもそも中国の禅プリス、禅文句、禅マンパーツ。で、
だからあんまり問題にならないんじゃないかな。
非常に問題になるんです。
Okay, great. We can talk about this.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.